Good afternoon. My name's Allison Wolf, and I have the privilege of being the Director of Graduate Studies in the Philosophy Department here at Universidad de los Andes. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you, and especially to welcome our distinguished guest this afternoon, Vincent Lloyd. We're so happy to have you. And we're so happy to have you because one of the distinguishing characteristics of our graduate program is a constant commitment to connect philosophy, not only to other disciplines, but to various issues that are happening in the world around us. And we just think that obviously for many years now, the Black Lives Matter movement and the related social movements around race and racism in the United States have not just remained in the United States, they have been catching fire and going around the world and creating so many interesting new paths for this topic. And so we're really excited to have all of you here. Thank you for taking the time. And thank you, Dr. Lloyd, for being here with us this afternoon. The plan is for my dear colleague, Carlos Manrique, to give a brief presentation and to introduce Dr. Lloyd. Then we're going to hear his remarks, which I'm sure will be very interesting. And then we'll take questions in the chat. As I understand it, you can put questions in the chat in either English or Spanish, and they will be, but we're going to be speaking in English. At the same time, we are grateful to Laura Munoz, that's a new word, because she is going to be doing a simultaneous translation so that we can make this talk accessible to as many people in the audience as possible. So with that, thank you again for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you all, and it's a great pleasure, Vincent, for that you are here. Thank you so much. Carlos?
Hi, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce Professor Vincent Lloyd, who has to join us in this annual inaugural lecture of graduate programs at the Department of Philosophy of Universidad de los Andes. Thank you, Vincent, for joining us. Vincent is Associate Professor of the College of Arts and Sciences at Villanova University. He is also the current Political Theology, former Political Theology Network, and the Center for Africana Studies. Vincent, I'm going to give you some information of his trajectory and his work in order to introduce him. He received PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. And since 2009 to the present, he has published 6 books and been co-editor and contributor to 9 books, exploring from different angles and in path-breaking ways the complex relations between race, social movements, and politics in the history, but also the contemporary social life of the United States. From this impressive work, books and their illuminating and insightful solutions. First, the compilation Race and Citizenship in America, published in 2016 by Columbia University Press, historical processes through which, in the, I quote, race and religion are excluded or managed, the way these processes are intertwined, and the way they are inflected and in specific exercises of power, end of quote. Second, a far-reaching book, Black Natural Law, Beyond Secularism and Multiculturalism, published 2016 by Oxford University Press, in which Vincent reconstructs the religious and political thought of crucial figures in the history for justice in the United States, such as Frederick Cooper and Martin Luther King, among others. This reconstruction, vision of these figures shows how the cure for the management of difference, religious and racial, in the contemporary United States tends to domesticate or silence altogether the critical and transformative tradition of Black political activism and of Black philosophical and theological thought. The work thus poses a challenge to certain common, good-mannered, and self-complacent liberal Western democracies that disavow and tend to erase away from our the persistent forms of structural violence and injustice to which communities historically subjected to forms of racial and socioeconomic exclusion are exposed. But most importantly, perhaps, this work shows how these mannered discourses of diversity tend to erase and silence the conceptual and resources that marginalized communities themselves have historically cultivated in their patient and long-dated labor, proposing novel ways of conceiving our and the conflicts first. In this same line of inquiry, concerned with the ways in which social movements understand the social and political worlds we inhabit, I mentioned from Vincent's work, which is the book Black Dignity, a Philosophy, upcoming soon in University Press, and which is the exploration that he will be sharing with us today. I would also like to stress another dimension of Vincent's work, which I find particularly admirable, which has to do with promoting rigorous and constructive relation between academic research, philosophical thought, and platforms of political activism that are struggling in the ground for more just, hospitable, inclusive, and caring societies. Vincent's work gives us connections between academic research and social movements can be enhancing, both in a political and epistemological level, both for advancing the causes for social justice and for allowing us to better understand the dynamics of our social and political world. This orientation of the political theology network formed to the Center for Political Theology, which Vincent has led for the past years, and one of whose central aims is collaborations between interdisciplinary academic work and grassroots social movement in concrete political struggles. Vincent has been passionately engaged with the prison abolition and the platforms where diversity converge. Academic work and his public engagement in a close and constructive dialogue with social movements and the creative, conceptual, and pragmatic resources that Vincent reminds us how social transformations come about when the frontier between what of thinking installed in a given society affirm as possible and what they disdain as impossible. This frontier shifts historically, and social transformations take place in those shifts. The impossible is not the opposite or the real, as some would have it or tend to make us believe, but rather it emerges from historical struggles. More precisely, it emerges from the alternative form and inhabiting our common life that have been enacted in the experience of peoples who have organized to confront injustice, violence, bottom up. Vincent's work shows us quite how immense challenges that our societies face today require the retrieval of the epistemological and moral resources in the histories of these struggles. Thank you so much, Vincent, for being today with us. We are so happy and honored to have you here.
Muchas gracias por la invitación de hablar con ustedes. Lamento no puedo estar con ustedes en persona y también que tengo que hablar en inglés. Espero conocer a ustedes en persona el próximo verano cuando visita Colombia. Quizás mi español será mejor el próximo verano. In August 2018, I found myself returning a rental car in Florissant, Missouri, the St. Louis suburb next to Ferguson. I had driven 14 hours from my home in Philadelphia with my suitcases and pit bull to spend a year near the neighborhood that had become a symbol of Black protest. Just a few years before, I had been convinced that Black politics was over, the struggle for racial justice abandoned. The era of the struggle's great heroes, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Anna Julia Cooper had passed. Martin Luther King Jr. was now an icon of peace, love, and nonviolence celebrated by all. The Black leaders who occupied the media spotlight were either caricatures of King clinging to his memory, or else they accepted the terms of electoral politics, naming diversity as one issue among many on which work remained to be done. A few intellectuals spoke out about systemic racism. A few radicals organized Black folks for occasional protests. But the grandeur of the Black political tradition, the way it tightly tied together a deep cutting critique to the slow grassroots work of organizing, was a thing of the past. Then a police officer shot at a Black teenager named Michael Brown 12 times and let his body lie on a Ferguson street for 4 hours. Local Black youths took to the streets to protest. The police responded with armored cars and tear gas, and the national spotlight shone on Ferguson to uncover what Black folks there knew all too well, that they were chronically subject to exorbitant city fines, police harassment, and police violence. Black Americans across the country recognized the violence to body and soul on display in Ferguson as the same violence we faced daily in our communities. The political environment was shifting, but so was the political vocabulary employed by Black youths and young adults who identified with the struggle. Where diversity, multiculturalism, racism, and nonviolence had been the language of African-American politics, a new era of capital B Black politics was opening with a new moral vocabulary. The hashtag Black Lives Matter came to name the movement, but the movement is also defined by Black rage, Black love, Black family, Black futures, Black study, and Black girl magic, among others. Over my year in Missouri, I talked with Black youths who had been involved in the Ferguson uprising and with middle-class Black folks who observed it. I returned to the Black classics with new eyes. I began to understand that the hashtags circulating in Ferguson and around the Black world formed a coherent moral political vision. The thread running through that vision, orienting it toward struggle, is a commitment to Black dignity. Today, I will briefly sketch out the vision of today's racial justice movement in the US. I also think with that vision, probe it and give it shape and coherence that I did not find in the words of movement participants, even as I take those words as a starting point. Put another way, this is not a traditional work of philosophy that sets out axioms and works from premises to conclusions. Instead, I move back and forth between listening and structuring, between activist rhetoric and crisper connected concepts. While this may frustrate those looking only for a description of activist beliefs or for a systematic theory of dignity, I believe my method is the best way to take activists seriously as intellectuals, as philosophers, whose thought grows out of and refines through the struggle for justice. Taking activists seriously also means at times disagreeing with them. Professed commitments do not always match an underlying orientation, especially in the heat of protest. I'm interested in the deeper currents of struggle, which I believe continue and strengthen the currents of Black struggle that have run for decades and centuries. Unfortunately, we live in a moment when disagreement on matters associated with race stops conversations when precise affirmation or retweeting of a certain discourse on race cleaves friends from enemies. We are stuck at the surface in the moment. Philosophy promises to dive deeper, challenging the conventional wisdom of public discourse and movement discourse, turning not only to revered Black leaders of the past, but also to those overlooked or dismissed as suspect, and making arguments about how best to live and to struggle that are not perfectly aligned with activists, although motivated by the same imperatives as activists. This is philosophy at its best, asking tough questions that push beyond platitudes. The concept of dignity has long been at the center of Black politics and life. When Martin Luther King Jr. accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he described the civil rights movement as an attempt, quote, to find a new sense of dignity. Black Power leader Stokely Carmichael spoke of assembling a coalition of Black Power advocates who were joined by their commitment, quote, to rebuild their dignity. Barack Obama, receiving his Nobel, argued that, quote, we can admit the intractability of deprivation and still strive for dignity. From Black nationalist Marcus Garvey to Nation of Islam leader Malcolm X, from journalist Ida B. Wells to activist Angela Davis, dignity is always found around Black struggle. It is no surprise that the word shows up in the first line of the Movement for Black Lives platform and in the way movement founders speak of their intentions. Alicia Garza describes the movement's core commitment, quote, when we say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the ways in which Black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. Patrice Cullors names the grassroots organization she founded Dignity and Power Now, and she reflects, quote, I come to all my work from a deep philosophical place that asks, what does it take for humans to live in our full humanity and allow for others to live in their full dignity? Opal Tometi, the third of the movement's three founders, says its central goal is, quote, to protect and affirm the beauty and dignity of all Black lives. While the term dignity appears often in the history of Black politics, it has been used in such varied ways that it is not even clear whether it has meaning beyond its rhetorical force. Sometimes it seems dignity is used as a synonym for humanity. To treat someone with dignity is to treat them as a fellow human worthy of respect. Or in a theological register, recognizing and revering the image of God in a human. But this sense of dignity as a status captures only one of its aspects. It is like the projection of a three-dimensional shape onto a two-dimensional surface. Dignity is also something you do, a practice, a performance, a way of engaging with the world. This is a special insight of the Black political tradition, skeptical as it is of abstractions. With time frozen, dignity may look like a status, but in its natural habitat, dignity names friction. In a world that would deny Black humanity and embraces racial domination, dignity names an affirmation of that humanity, which necessarily means struggle against domination. This more complex sense of dignity is evident when we consider the case of Black athlete, singer, lawyer, and activist Paul Robeson. When Robeson wore his legal hat, for example, petitioning the United Nations in 1951 to address racism in the US, he invoked dignity as a status. The text of the petition enumerates crimes inflicted on our dignity, matching the language of the emerging international human rights regime. Yet even this legal document contains hints that dignity has another dimension. The next line is, we struggle for deliverance, not without pride in our valor. One sense of dignity is attacked by racism, but this makes another sense of dignity come to light. Dignity achieved in struggle, not at the end point, but in the very process. This is not a concept Robeson learned from the United Nations. He spoke of dignity frequently throughout his life, as early as his 1919 valedictory address at Rutgers, through his travels in solidarity with working class people around the world, and during his years of isolation in the US due to blacklisting. Throughout his life, status did not exhaust the meaning Robeson found in dignity. For example, speaking about the evils of segregation in New Orleans in 1942, he proclaims, quote, "I had never put a correct evaluation on the dignity and courage of my people of the Deep South until I began to come south myself." He continues, "I see them now courageous and possessors of a profound and instinctive dignity." The dignity he invokes is the practice of living in a world bent on the destruction of Black life. Sometimes dignity connotes struggle on a grand scale in activism and organizing. At other times, the struggle is simply for survival. In either case, when the focus is on any given slice of time, dignity has the appearance of a status possessed. Such a focus ignores the richer sense of dignity in motion. As a singer and actor, Robeson was frequently described as a paradigm of dignity, dignity practiced, performed. In his portrayals of working class people throughout the world, from Welsh miners to Jewish resistance fighters to Black Americans, he translated the struggles he encountered into stories and songs with which all could identify. In his own performances, Robeson made visible the dignity of those struggling against the denial of their humanity, making dignity contagious. As actor and activist Ossie Davis said of Robeson, "We have no category, even now, to hold the size of him. Something about him escapes our widest, most comprehensive embrace." Black Studies scholar Shauna Redman titled her recent study of Robeson, "Everything Man." But the expansiveness he embodied had its origins in the very particular experience of slavery. While Robeson was a paradigm of dignity for many audiences, his own paradigm of dignity was his father, who had been born in slavery and would later become a Presbyterian minister. From his father, Robeson learned, quote, that a so-called lowly station in life was no bar to a man's assertion of his full human dignity. The elder Robeson did not avert his eyes or bow down to whites, his body itself asserting dignity. In short, for Robeson, dignity is performed in multiple registers: political, everyday, aesthetic, and bodily, always in struggle, and ultimately routed through the experience of slavery. Note how Robeson invokes dignity to name the struggle against inhumanity, against the denial of dignity, as status. This distinction is key to dignity in Black thought. Black writers repeatedly distinguish between dignity in a stale, hollow sense and in the full, true sense. Those who are ascribed the status of dignity often do not really have it in the robust sense. Those who are denied the status of dignity often do really have dignity. In August 19th, a poem written in 1938 about the Black teenagers wrongly accused of raping white women in Alabama, known as the Scottsboro Boys, Langston Hughes writes that, quote, "A young Black boy will die, yet judges in high places still preserve their dignity. Those judges seem to have dignity, but do not. They are but cogs in the machine of white supremacy, and in service to that machine, they have become child killers." A decade later in Harlem Dance Hall, Hughes depicts dignity at its fullest. The poem begins and ends by proclaiming that the hall, quote, "had no dignity before, but when the band begins playing, quote, suddenly the earth was there and flowers, trees, and air." Dignity is realized in performance rather than in status, in dancing rather than in sitting, in harmony with nature rather than in being elevated above the world. This might not seem like an especially political or moral idea of dignity, but Black folks gathering in a world that would keep them apart, Black folks moving in a world that would keep them still, Black folks aligned with nature in a world that makes their lives unnatural. These are forms of struggle. They are challenges to those who would deny dignity to Blacks. Black dignity pushes against this denial. It does not enjoy a status that has been granted, but claims a status that has been denied. An important innovation embraced by the Black Lives Matter movement has been to cleave dignity from respectability, calling attention to the difference between a full understanding of dignity and a flat understanding that is not really dignity at all. Ordinary language often treats dignity and respectability as interchangeable, yet from the movement perspective, dignity is laudable, respectability indictable. The latter connotes an attempt to perform to a white audience, fulfilling white fantasies of how good Black people look and act, clean and articulate, to borrow the words Joseph Biden once used to describe then candidate Barack Obama. Well-dressed, heterosexual, middle class, deferential, knowing their place. Respectability is the illusion of dignity. This critical tool of cleaving dignity from its false copies is the start of explicating the philosophy of Black dignity. As the French Algerian activist Houria Boutelja puts it in a book inspired by the Black political tradition, quote, "Dignity is in our ability to distinguish stars from sequins. All this artifice that white people saddle themselves with to maintain a distance and subjugate us," unquote. When we turn from dignity as status to dignity as performance, as struggle, we find it easier to state clearly what dignity is not than what it is. When Hughes tries to speak affirmatively about what dignity looks like and feels like, he points to dancing bodies and uses metaphors. Those bodies are like the fullness of nature. This is precisely the style of analysis Black dignity requires. We cannot state necessary and sufficient conditions. We cannot offer a comprehensive list of exemplars. We cannot simply rely on knowing it when we see it. What we can do is twofold. First, we can clearly and forcefully name what dignity is not. Second, we can point to examples of where dignity could be, examples that are often fleeting performances, impossible to systematize and describable only by metaphor or in an aesthetic or imaginative register. This is the asymmetric style of analysis made necessary by the nature of dignity itself, but it is also the characteristic method of the broader philosophical project implicit in today's Black political movements that I abbreviate with the phrase Black dignity. We can have clarity and precision when speaking in the negative, and we appeal to the aesthetic or imaginative register when speaking in the positive. What do we want? An end to these injustices. What does justice look like? Nothing that can be captured in a systematic theory. The word justice is a placeholder for the inexpressible, an occasion to imagine or dance or sing the world free of domination. Frederick Douglass's eloquent narratives form the cornerstone of Black political thought. The towering Black intellectual of the 19th century, over his life, Douglass journeyed from slavery in Maryland to freedom in Massachusetts, from chattel to respected orator and writer, and finally, ambassador to Haiti. He tells in graphic detail of the horrors of slavery and relates how he came to navigate life enslaved, how he learned to read despite his owner's opposition, and how he eventually escaped. But the centerpiece of his narrative, the turning point, as he calls it, is his fight with the slave breaker, Covey. It is there that we find Black dignity in its purest form, in laboratory conditions, as it were. As a boy of 16, Douglass finds himself lent to a poor white farmer, Edward Covey, who has a reputation for crushing the will of slaves, making them pliable upon return to their owners. Covey whips Douglass repeatedly and mercilessly until Douglass runs off to his old master to appeal for help, only to be sent back to Covey. Upon his return, Covey first seems to ignore the boy's transgression. Then, as Douglas is going about his regular morning routine, feeding the horses, Covey sneaks up on him and tries to tie his legs with rope. Douglas leaps away. He has always been told to obey his master, to endure the brutality. There is no alternative. A slave who fought back could be hung by the town constable, likely after being tortured to set an example for others who might fight back. But for reasons he himself does not understand, Douglas resolved to fight. Quote, "I found my strong fingers firmly attached to the throat of the tyrant," Douglas writes, "as if we stood as equals before the law." It is as if Douglas sees a different reality, a future where there is equality instead of domination. And animated by that vision, he is able to fight. Covey, surprised by the boy's resistance, soon realizes that, man on man, he cannot defeat or capture Douglas. The master alone cannot control the slave. He calls his cousin to aid him, but together they fare no better than Covey alone. Used to always having his way, Covey is taken aback, scared and mute. The master lives under the illusion that he is really in control, that his power to command is a natural part of who he is. When that lie is exposed, he is shaken to the bone. He appeals for more help, trying to enlist 2 other slaves to capture Douglas. Risking violence to their own bodies, both refuse Covey's order. After 2 hours of trying on his own to capture Douglas, Covey relents. He tells Douglas to continue with the farm chores, and Douglas does, but he is now a new man. Covey will not whip him again, but there is a more significant change. The fight, quote, "rekindled in my breast the smoldering embers of liberty." Douglas was not free, but in his bodily struggle with Covey, he had a foretaste of freedom. He began dreaming more often about life without a master. At the same time, Douglas's self-image transformed, quote, "I was nothing before, I was a man now." He had believed what his master and his world said about him, that he was less than human, just another beast of burden on the farm. Struggle inspired him to struggle again in new ways for his freedom. Douglas concludes, quote, "A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity," dignity in struggle. In short, dignity means struggle against domination. The more struggle, the more dignity. The less struggle, the less dignity. The judges in the Scottsboro case have no dignity, only a false copy of dignity, because they do not struggle at all. They allow the system to work smoothly and are no more than properly functioning components of it, a system of racial domination. At core, those judges are undignified. Dignity is found where there is friction, where someone does not play her part. Dignity does not have to look like a political protest, though it can. It can also look like song, dance, jokes, sermons, or silence. In each case, dignity names performance, activity, including the activity of refusal, rather than result. Even in the specifically political case, dignity is not the status achieved. It lives in the process, in the organizing and protesting and plotting and collaborating, whether or not the political goal is obtained. In the midst of the Montgomery bus boycott, when success was far from certain, Martin Luther King Jr. told assembled protesters, quote, "I want you to know that this struggle has not been in vain. If it has done any one thing in this community, it has given us a new sense of dignity." Again, Dignity was in the struggle. In Douglas's case, struggle means a physical, bodily struggle against his master. With his whole being involved in struggle, risking death, he is transformed. But he does not struggle alone. His fellow slaves risk punishment, perhaps their lives, to side with him. And he does not just struggle against Covey. Covey's cousin also grapples with him. Even when it seems as if struggle is a quintessentially individual act, it draws on a community, and it aims not at defeating one individual, but at dismantling the hold of a system. Further, struggle and the dignity performed in struggle is contagious. Normally, the other slaves would have followed Covey's orders without question. But seeing Douglas's defiance, the illusion of their master's omnipotence was unmasked. When Covey sought to exercise his will over them, they also struggled. Their struggle took a different form from Douglas's. It was not bodily struggle, though it made their bodies vulnerable to harm. One of those slaves, Bill, at first pretends not to understand Covey. Then he redirects Covey's entreaties. Bill says, yes, indeed, he does not want to work. When Covey tells him that in that moment, his job is to bind Douglas, Bill turns legalistic. He has been rented to Covey by his own master, and the terms of that agreement permit farm work, not punishing slaves. Here we have on display a variety of forms of struggle, not only with bodies, but with other performances, with pretended ignorance and confusion, then with reasoning. Struggle can also be performed with the imagination, as new worlds free of domination are created in the mind, with aesthetic performance, as the master's ordering of the senses and emotions is brought into question, or through intellectual work, as the beliefs the master depends on are exposed as lies. Often when we think of struggle, we think of the difficult quest to obtain a particular object, the struggle to win or complete a race, to lose weight, to finish college while working a full-time job. When struggle aims at a particular object, let us call that ontic struggle. For the slave, the world is determined by the master. Each object in the slave's world is owned by the master. Each object in our world, where our perception and action are shaped by interlocking systems of domination, is constituted by those regimes of domination. The struggle to obtain any object may or may not be reasonable, and reflecting on such reasonableness may be important work, but the criteria of reasonableness are determined by systems of domination. Ontic struggle will not get us free. Only ontological struggle, struggle aimed at domination, struggle against the master, promises us that. Even struggle against oppression, exploitation, and harm is not necessarily a site of dignity. But every struggle against domination involves dignity. Domination means the capacity of one to arbitrarily exercise her will on another. Paradigmatically, domination names the relationship of a master to a slave. The master is not, at every moment, commanding a slave to do this or that, whip in hand, yet he is at every moment the master. Domination is defined by a capacity to act rather than by specific acts. One who is enslaved may never be flogged, but the whip still stands as a symbol of that relationship of domination. Some interpreters of Douglas's fight with Covey take his desired object to be recognition. He wants to be seen as a human being by Covey and the world, as equal in standing to all other humans. On this view, dignity is indeed achieved through struggle, but the struggle is to be properly recognized, impossible in a world where some are masters and others are slaves. However, this confuses the slave's object in struggle. Douglas wants to be free from Covey's domination, whether Covey recognizes or does not recognize him as secondary. Douglas certainly does not want to be recognized as a fellow master, as a man capable of owning slaves. To desire recognition in the world is to accept that the world has a final say in matters of recognition, when the world is infected by domination. To succeed in such a struggle is to succeed in achieving the position of master, which is no success at all. When struggle is understood to aim at recognition, it is given an ontic rather than an ontological meaning. Crucially, the object of ontological struggle is, by definition, impossible to achieve. Covey can never set Douglas free. In the closed world of slave and master, struggle against the master will never obtain its end. Yet, despite its manifest impossibility, that end continues to animate struggle. Temporally, the world remains closed. A future of freedom is impossible, but in another sense, the world opens. In the process of struggle, freedom can be dreamed, and such dreams call into question the absolute control of the master, motivating more struggle. In our much more complex world, ontological struggle also aims at an impossible object, a world free of systems of domination. If the object of struggle were obtainable, if there were a path we could plot from here to there, it would not be the object that we truly desire. It would be just another worldly object brought into being by systems of domination, ontic, not ontological. Domination extends from a specific interpersonal relationship, master and slave, to a system, obfuscating its origins and mechanism. In the starkest forms of slavery, persuading a person that another person can be treated as a slave requires an enormous apparatus of ideas, habits, feelings, institutions, and laws that conspire to make one class of people appear less than human. The Atlantic slave trade added a physical difference to the conspiracy, resulting in the package known as racialization. Even when one element is suspended, such as the legal regime of slavery, the apparatus persists, and it is the whole apparatus that creates the relationship of domination. The violence that symbolizes that relationship persists, but in new forms. Lynching replaces flogging, prison replaces lynching, the policeman's gun replaces the nightstick, which replaces the convict lease system. The symbols are impermanent, but the psychic and social work they perform is consistent, reinforcing systems of racial domination that constitute the afterlives of slavery that persist into the present. When domination is understood as an expansive apparatus that includes ideas, habits, feelings, institutions, and laws, struggle against it can take place in any of these dimensions. Domination persists, persists when enough of the elements of the apparatus work together, sustaining ideas or feelings or laws that authorize, for example, anti-Black racism, against which Black people struggle through music or protest or tactical silence. This is the essence of dignity. The proper object of struggle in its ontological sense is domination, recognizable because it necessarily involves the arbitrary exercise of one's will over another. In the primal scene of domination, the master's will is the overriding reality. In the world at large, often there is no one person standing as master, so there may seem to be no will involved. focusing on the arbitrary exercise of individual will can even mislead. It can draw our attention to the bad apple, the police officer who is disproportionately harassing Black motorists, or the boss who dismisses applicants with Black-sounding names, rather than the system of domination of which those individuals play a part. In most cases, no one individual is clearly in a position of domination. For example, with respect to the toxic air that clouds Black neighborhoods, the wealth gap between Black and white households, or the discomfort at an all-white party when a Black friend of a friend shows up. Those who see these situations as instances of anti-Blackness tend to speak of the culpability of the system of racism, oppression, or domination. Their language is necessarily vague, requiring us to imagine the system, in a sense, imposing its will on individuals. Instead of conjuring an abstract system and then anthropomorphizing it, a better approach is to toggle between the primal scene of domination, such as the one described by Douglas, and the complexities of the real world. If we can tell the right kind of story, linking that primal scene with a set of practices in the real world, we will have identified the one whose will looms over the life of another. In that primal scene, it is obviously Covey's will that can be arbitrarily imposed on Douglas. In fact, moving from an abstract primal scene to Douglas's world already introduces complexities. Covey is also an instrument in a system enlisted by Douglas's owner. It then becomes an empirical task to fill in the details of purported domination in any given context, demonstrate how they are linked into a system, and show how that system is structurally homologous to the primal scene of domination. In this way, domination points to an ontological condition rooted in its primal scene, whereas concepts like oppression, suffering, exploitation, injustice, and marginalization point to ontic conditions, specific harms in the world. Domination infects the world, but it conceals itself, making it appear that there is no domination at all, and that all that matters is the ontic, not the ontological register. One means of concealment is naturalization. The way things are is the way they have always been. It is the way of the world, the way things must be. Whites are masters and Blacks are slaves. Whites are responsible and Blacks are prone to criminality. Whites are better at science and Blacks are better at dancing. Another means of concealment, to make it seem as though social practice and norms are all there is, as though all that matters is what is done and what ought to be done. There may be serious problems, knots in the makeup of our world, but they can be fixed through imminent critique. We just need to name our deeply held values, such as treating everyone equally, and use these to inform the changes in our norms needed to solve problems like racism. But anti-Blackness is baked into the constitution of our world. It is not a discrete problem that can be solved. Struggle against domination means struggle against amorphous but deeply entrenched systems that include racial domination. The relationship between white master and Black slave in the Atlantic world represents domination at its purest. And this is why struggle against racial domination is the paradigm of struggle, and Black dignity is the paradigm of dignity. And Black philosophy is the starting point of all philosophy. This is why Black deserves an uppercase B. It marks the ontological sense of domination made visible by Black slavery. There are, of course, other forms of domination, colonial, capitalism, and so on. There are metropolitan elites, men and bosses who function as slave masters, however they might wish to distance themselves from it. Forms of domination are certainly interconnected, and there is dignity in struggle against each. But nowhere else is the mechanism of domination as precise as in anti-Black racism. Never can we be as confident about correctly identifying dignity as when we identify Black dignity. But just because we privilege one primal scene of domination, that does not make anti-Blackness separable from other systems of domination. We suffer from many diseases at once, and we will never be disease-free. Each ailment qualifies as a system of domination if a story can be told, linking it to its primal scene rape as a primal scene of patriarchy, indigenous dispossession as the primal scene of settler colonialism, the theft of labor power as a primal scene of capitalism, and so on. Any object in the world is simultaneously constituted by multiple interlocking systems of domination. Most of the time, when we navigate the world in ordinary life, we bracket this ontological realm and so may forget about the ontological register. When we attend to the struggle against domination, clarifying our target and tactics, we must pay attention to the ontological register, sometimes moving our analysis quickly among primal scenes, multiple primal scenes of domination. So here we have Black dignity, struggle against domination. This account of dignity contrasts sharply with other accounts in circulation. In one story of dignity's history, once upon a time before modernity, dignity referred to the honors and privileges of high rank. Dignity was had by kings and nobles, church leaders and government officials. It was an attribute of dignitaries. Dukes or bishops or judges of equal rank had equal dignity. Then in the late 18th century, according to political philosopher Jeremy Waldron, there was a transvaluation of values. Now, ordinary people were granted dignity, while the dignity of nobles was found to be superficial or bogus. In the modern world, all human beings are thought to share the same rank, and their common humanity gives all equal dignity. This democratized sense of dignity was embraced after the Second World War in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the constitutions of 142 countries. The sense of dignity found in today's racial justice movements resembles neither the pre-modern nor the modern concepts. It does not pick out classes of elites and name their status. Quite the opposite. From the perspective of Black dignity, dignitaries have the hollow appearance of dignity. In theory, a dignitary participates in some system of domination, in some form of mastery, and so is void of dignity. The world is more complicated than any theory, of course. Nor does the modern concept of dignity fit from the perspective of Black movements. Not every human being shares in dignity equally. Some people have more and some less. Some people are aligned with masters. Even some of the enslaved are aligned with masters, and thus have no dignity at all. Only those aligned with the enslaved struggling against domination have dignity. In a sense, Black dignity inverts the aristocratic hierarchy, elevating the lowliest and demoting the highest. Harriet Tubman, Angela Davis, and Assata Shakur have dignity. Thomas Jefferson, John D. Rockefeller, and the Queen of England have none. But in two senses, Black dignity is fundamentally committed to equality and to the equal distribution of dignity. Struggle against domination is motivated by a vision of a world without domination. Though that world is presently inaccessible, we have a foretaste of it in the expansive practices of struggle, political organizing, dancing, dreaming. In that envisioned world, where every system of domination is dismantled, there will be equality. The physical signs of domination are bowing one's head, averting one's eyes. Once domination is no more, We will all look at each other in the eyes and hold our heads high. But there is no path from our world to that world. For our world is so full of interlocking systems of domination that if we were to imagine such a path, as many do, it would already be infected by the ideas, feelings, habits, and values of some present system of domination. The only way to access it, and then only imperfectly, is in a different register through poetry or art or song. The other sense in which Black dignity is fundamentally committed to equality is in the view that systems of domination are so expansive, so numerous, so interconnected that we are each, all of the time, master, both master and slave. Even the most marginalized, in caricature, the queer, poor, Black, disabled, immigrant woman, has been formed in a world of homophobia, capitalism, white supremacy, ableism, and xenophobia that have shaped her ideas, feelings, habits, and values. Even as she struggles to organize against the laws, norms, and institutions that dominate her, she will never fully purge herself of internalized oppression, which not only affects how she sees herself, but also helps perpetuate the systems of domination that place others in the role of slave. Conversely, even the most privileged person is, in some aspect of his life, struggling against domination in some form. This is the human condition. We are at once master and slave, enjoying some benefits of privilege and struggling against some who have privilege. Our struggles are not only external against laws and institutions, but internal against our own malformed habits, feelings, and values. In this sense, we all participate in dignity because we all struggle against domination. Orders of magnitude separate the types and degrees of struggle required of different people, but the struggle against domination is part of the human condition. We all have a taste of dignity, and it primes us for more, to participate in struggles with others, to challenge even the most entrenched systems of domination. But to discern dignity and to clarify how it manifests requires routing our analysis through the ultimate paradigm of dignity, Blackness. Thank you very much for listening, and especially thanks to the translator. I'm looking forward to the conversation in the chat.
Thank you, Vincent, for an extraordinary presentation and challenging. Thank you so much. So for our Q&A session, I would in the English channel of the room. Please, and want to ask a question, just please raise your hand, and you can either in English or Spanish, and I will translate it if it is in Spanish. Or you can also write, if you are in the Spanish channel or the English channel of the meeting, you can also questions in the chat. So please just raise your hand, write your question, and we'll give you the. So perhaps I will start just giving people time to warm up and formulate their questions. I will start with two questions, Vincent, that I find aspects of your presentation is how dignity is related to a certain or unpresentable or undeterminable human. So this kind of philosophical anthropology that intersects in some way with a, with the fact that we can never define who human beings are, and that kind of negativity is crucial for your understanding of dignity, and also for your understanding something not only that is performed in this of struggle, but also respect to how we can think about dignity, because there is a challenge, right, for philosophical thought to account for it, because we cannot name it directly. So there is this challenge for philosophical thinking in terms of how to convey, perhaps obliquely or indirectly, right? One aspect that I find fascinating, and that of course is very related to your Black Natural Law book, because you are talking there in the Black Natural Martin Luther King's, for example, understanding of law as one that demands justice, even social order, and how crucial it is that this this natural law is dogmatic, because there is no human being stated upon. So that interesting how you pose a challenge for kind of how phenomenologically, at a challenge of talking about dignity, because it cannot name it directly because of the same character. So question. And the other question, Vincent, is about, I find very compelling. So my internet connection is unstable, so if I get frozen, just let me know. Question is about the temporality of the, let's say, performances of dignity, right, in the struggle. I find something very compelling, and something about what you're telling us, temporality that is not teleological, that is not necessarily oriented towards a specific political goal. So I find very compelling that it allows us to understand the force of the uprising, for example, in the social protests a year ago in the States, right? The political significance of those moments for collective action and struggle against dignity in the scene of social protest, without significance in terms of what objectives were finally achieved in terms of state reforms. So I find that very compelling, and then I find something problematic, and I would just what is kind of this idea of this ontological domination that endures, and even if there are some forms at what you call the ontic level of social life, right? So what I find a little bit problematic there is, for example, how can we think that a struggle like Black Lives Matter, for example, the civil rights movement a couple of decades ago, actually do something to the, call it, actually affect the apparatus in some way, if we think as the apparatus of the social structure. Not even, I would say, there is something, even society at its ontological level is not the same. One would think it is the same. So that is what I find a little bit problematic in terms of this temporality of for and dignity understood as this performance in forms of collective struggle. So the two questions that I will
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those great questions, which I think are also helpful at making explicit and highlighting points that I was trying to think through. So the first point your first question has to do with the negativity, and there's a wonderful line that Judith Butler has in one of her more recent books about the human being a marker of that which exceeds representation. Rather than trying to come up with definitions for the human, to come up with concepts that match the human, we should allow the human to be this marker of excess. And I think that resonates richly with theological traditions, right, where the human as imaging God is a site of reverence because of that excessiveness of the human, but also with a style of philosophical thinking that embraces the negative. And I do, I mean, Carlos asked the really helpful question. If one if one's philosophical anthropology is committed to this negativity and to dignity as working the negative, right, as sort of probing collectively that aspect of the human which is exceeding the world and so pushing against the world, right, and so in a site of friction with the world. If that is your philosophical anthropology, then what is your philosophical method, right? How do you go about investigating that? And I think that's a good question. I am toying with this idea of thinking philosophically with social movements as one response to that kind of question. Social movements necessarily having a messiness that pushes against, that aligns with the negative, and that is always calling for revision, always calling for critique, and yet also always oriented toward justice. And the philosophical work being that clarification of that orientation, the clarification of the concepts that orient implicit in social movements. But in more traditional philosophical sites, I think one also finds useful methods, right? Phenomenology, in whether it's the thought of Michel Henry or Jean-Luc Marion, right, are also grappling with the negative in different ways and using phenomenological analysis in a quite rigorous and technical sense as a means of working the negative in different senses. And of course, Emmanuel Levinas, I think, has parallel motivations, right? Levinas's project is routed through the Jewish Holocaust, and taking philosophical phenomenological analysis as always oriented by that experience. The parallel with what I'm talking about is this experience of the slave trade as the experience through which philosophical analysis must be routed, and then that can open to a sort of rigorous phenomenological analysis or other forms of analysis. With respect to your second question about temporality, I think this is one of the really exciting things about the social movement discourse in the US in the last 5 or so years. And under the banner of abolitionism, right? There's a sense of urgency, right? And a rejection of pragmatism, right? That when we see domination and systems of domination, like the prison, like forms of anti-Blackness, they have to stop now. If we saw slavery, we wouldn't come up with a plan to phase out slavery over decades. We wouldn't do pragmatic calculations to figure out, when slavery is okay or not okay, right? We would say this must end now. And so if we can frame other political issues of the day as having a similar structure as slavery, then they call for a similar urgency. But just because there's that urgency doesn't mean that there's no engagement with existing institutions or practices or actors, right? And there's a rapidly developing conversation about what that means. What does a non-reformist reform look like? A reform that's committed to shrinking systems of domination rather than a reform that can be co-opted by systems of domination. And that, that conversation relies on this temporality, right? Relies on an aspiration, oriented toward the future of a world of justice about which we cannot speak, but which perhaps we can sing and dance and perform in other ways. I don't want to go on and on. I know there are other questions, but hopefully that responds starts to respond to yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Vince. So there is a question in the chat, and then there is a hand raised. So I will go in the order with the question in the chat. Try to question says like this because it brings in Colombia, right? But it has to do with the question of multicultural, something that you are also thinking about, no? So I think the question to how here in the context in Colombia, the kind of language and the kind of institutional thing for the struggles of marginalized, racialized communities, as people, Afro-Colombians, is the language of multiculturalism, the language that recognizes their cultural identity as the bearer of a recognition from the state and from the law. So I think the question, how can we evaluate that in terms of what you are proposing? Would that would those struggles a way of kind of the world of the master are kind of in the given institutional settings and languages that the master has, or is there a different way of viewing it, or how then? I think with your arguments with respect to how Black dignity exceeds the framework of multicultural and managing diversity.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Before I forget, I should advertise my colleague Jana Hunter-Bowman's wonderful book that's coming out next year on the Colombian situation and political theology, and thinking through some of these post-conflict questions in ways that I think are complementary to those that I'm thinking with. So multiculturalism is, I should say, in the US social movement case, right? Multiculturalism was the hegemonic way in which race was discussed from the end of the civil rights movement until the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. Right? And that involved desires for recognition, and it also involved desires for cultural appreciation and acceptance, as Carlos mentioned in his explication of the question. And of course, these two desires are both important, right? To be recognized and to have one's culture appreciated. The worry, though, is when that is the end of the conversation, when these are the only goals, and when these goals of recognition and cultural affirmation are not tactics or points on the way to dismantling systems of domination, but are promised as, you know, the land of milk and honey, right? The place where, you know, justice will exist. And in the U.S. case, there were great efforts in the direction of multiculturalism at the level of discourse, and in some cases at the level of practice. And yet empirically, all of the measures of racism remained basically the same from 1950s to the 2021, right? Education, income inequality, environmental racism, police violence, right? All of these sorts of measures we think should have improved through multiculturalism as a framework, but actually stayed about the same. It also calls into question the civil rights movement itself as a success story, right? Was it a success story if these measures have stayed the same? So, I mean, my general concern in this project around Black dignity is to say that there may be times when asking institutions for recognition and affirming culture is useful and important, but that is not the end of the story. That's a tactic rather than the goal. And the goal is dismantling systems of domination, and that is this kind of unending work, right? When that happens at the ontological level, in the same way that for Levinas, to switch back to the philosophical register, this encounter with the other, right, which is at the heart of his philosophical reflections, has to be repeated over and over again, right? We're always being distracted from it, right? We're always mediating between many different people and many different needs, and balancing those different needs and people and desires. And yet we still have to return to something more fundamental. And in the analogous case here, that something more fundamental is this return to the primal scene of domination. I hope that's somewhat responsive.
Thank you, Vincent. Dayson said yes. Thanks. Lorenzo. Lorenzo. No sé si nos puedes ayudar. Que ahí hay, a ver, yo. A ver.
Perdón, gracias. Ahora sí, ¿me oyen bien?
Sí, dale. Ahí te escuchamos.
Thank you, Vincent, for that talk. I really appreciated that. I wanted to ask a question that comes from a place of struggle, or of, you know, someone who was part of the riots and who was part of what was going on this summer in the U.S. And I was kind of terrified by the kind of line of what of seeing what has happened to BLM and what Black Lives Matter, where Black Lives Matter slogan appear these days. I saw it recently in the new building of Columbia that managed to expropriate a bunch of people and, like, you know, kick people out of Harlem even more and more. And, you know, we are inundated with Amazon wonderful signs of Black Lives Matter everywhere. So I was wondering at first if you thought that had something to do with a kind of rhetoric or valuation of life, a kind of rhetoric or valuation of life that remains, that has to be critically thought from within the movement, and from how those kind of, you know, who was saying Black Lives Matters from the beginning. I think I heard someone like Fred Moten saying something recently about how, you know, the first people who said Black Lives Matter were the slave owners holding in the ship, right? Who were very worried about what kind of life mattered and how it could matter, and in what ways it could be commodified and, you know, rendered into a system of valuation of life that was inherently about the destruction and the murderous, you know, continuation of that system. And so I'm kind of tied to that. I think I'm asking a question also about how BLM, how can we think about it in connection to the anti-colonial movements and to movements outside of the US, particularly in Colombia, but elsewhere, right? Where, you know, how do we think, not just theoretically, but practically, about those alliances that, you know, the Black Panther movement was really, really eager to think of their movement as an international, transnational anti-colonial movement, right? And I'm worried about a kind of more shrink perspective of the Black Lives Matter movement in questioning and in doing that kind of critical alliance of thinking anti-coloniality and anti-Blackness at the same time. So I was wondering how dignity, where dignity leaves us in this problem, and what kind of critique of the movement from within, right? Not the kind of shitty critique that we're used to as academics, but a critique with love is where I want to come from, right? As how do we think about the easy ways in which these movements get appropriated within capital, and yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. And thank you so much for your talk, and yeah, I'm eager to hear you.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question, and I do think sometimes the phrase Black Lives Matter abbreviates a quite complex set of things, right? And even if we think about one social movement in the US, what Black Lives Matter as a social movement looked like after the death of Trayvon Martin versus after the death of Michael Brown, Ferguson, versus after the death of George Floyd in 2020 in Minnesota. Each of these gave a different flavor to the movement and resulted in different internal conflicts and possibilities. After in 2020, right, there was in part because of the pandemic as an ambient condition, and in part because of the work of the earlier iterations of the movement, there was a much wider participation, especially among white and middle-class Americans in Black Lives Matter related protests. And finally, over 50% of people for the first time had sympathy for Black Lives Matter, whereas before, more minority, polling was showing a minority of people were sympathetic. Similarly, after Michael Brown, right, there was a community in St. Louis that was at the center of that, had a quite different flavor than the community in California that was at the center of the post-Trayvon Martin organizing. And the throughout these different iterations, there has been an emphasis on developing leadership rather than taking certain individuals as leaders, which I think is really laudable and a nice welcome change from earlier movements. But after 2020, when became mass participation in protests, and protest became synonymous with movement, right? Which is false, right? A protest is not a movement, right? Although a movement can have protests, and protests can prime those for participation in movements. That emphasis on building capacity, building leadership, building the virtues, right, as part of movement organizing fell away just because of the scale of what happened in 2020. So yeah, I think attending to these dynamics is really important, but it's also important from a kind of philosophical perspective, at least in our context here, to distinguish rhetoric, right, from phenomena, and slogan from values, right? And I mean, we can argue about slogans and how effective, whether they latch onto or don't latch onto values represented by movements. But what strikes me as most interesting and productive are the values and commitments implicit in a movement, right? That are voiced by movement actors, sometimes, not always, and that are found implicit in the practice of a movement, right? Sometimes in images, right? Now that we've moved from hashtags to Instagram as a primary vehicle or medium through which movement ideas circulate, right? It's a world of images that hold the values. And as philosophers, in our case, right, part of our task is to make explicit, and to borrow a phrase from Bob Random, right? Make explicit what's implicit in these social practices, and also to challenge them, right? To challenge movements to say, some of what you're saying is coherent and built, oriented toward justice, and fits together. And some of it seems discordant, right? And let's ask questions. Let's have a dialogue about where the deepest commitments in this movement are, and where there might be practices or rhetoric that is pulling away from those deeper commitments. This is a task that I think philosophers are particularly well suited to do and to engage in. And yet it seems like it's only rarely that we have these kind of critical dialogues between those who have the luxury of sitting in the academy and having the time and space to do some critical reflection, and the movement participants who are immersed in worlds and may not have that. I hope that starts to respond to that.
Great. Okay. Do you hear me, Vincent? Okay. Because I was expelled from the meeting. There was a problem of connection, and so I had to come in again. But I appreciate very much, Vincent, that you are joining us in this space. Thank you very much for your very suggestive and very thought-provoking and moving talk. Thank you very much for your generosity and your patience in the conversation and addressing our questions. And thank you to everyone that joined us in this conversation. We were planned to go up to 6:45, so we are almost there, and so I think we are. If there aren't any more comments or questions, which I see there aren't any hands raised. So I just wanted to thank you all for being with us and sharing this space and this conversation on topics that are so urgent and that are so moving, I'm sure, for all of us. And thank you so much, Vincent, for your disposition and for your generosity and for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and muchas gracias.
Okay, so thank you all, and it was a great pleasure, and I hope we can see you soon again, Vincent.
Yes.